Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq. Joining me at the market site in Times Square, New York City, we have Charles Hecker, who's a senior partner over at Control Risks. We're going to take a look at the 2020 RiskMap report and three key areas that he has identified that companies need to be aware of. It's great to have you with us at Market Site. Welcome. And hot topic, everyone is talking about this. Navigating around increased cyber activity. It's the forefront of any chief technology officer.
Yeah, that's right. Cyber fits very squarely into our top 5 risks for business for 2020. And we think companies have to prepare for a pretty unusual year coming up. There's going to be hostile activity coming from state actors, coming from non-state actors. And we think that the United States is going to start to respond to cyber hostility in a way that shows it really cares. And we'll be able to see and hear about the US activity in cyber conflict, and that might actually trigger a bit of a global escalation in cyber hostility around the world.
Shouldn't we have already been responding to these threats because they're real?
Yeah, you're right. And I think that companies are already juggling a number of very serious cyber threats. I think that there's a tendency in the business community to think that the solution to this is buy a lot of tech, buy a lot of equipment, or install lots and lots of software. And while that is a part of the solution, one of the things that companies are overlooking is monitoring threats that are relevant to them, and looking at their geographic footprint, looking at their sectoral footprint, looking at where they intersect with the activist society, and understanding, to put it quite bluntly, to understanding who's out to get them. Right. More importantly, understanding who's not out to get them, and understanding which threats are getting closer to you and which threats you don't have to worry about.
Right, you should almost hire counterintelligence and get ex-elite hackers like they do for casinos.
It's exactly the way it works. It is called threat monitoring of intelligence. And so what you're doing is you're looking at potential hostile actors towards your company, and you're asking yourself 2 questions about those actors. You're asking, what is their intent? What do they want to do to you? And then what is their capability for carrying out that intent? They may want to harm you, they may have something against your company, but they don't have the wherewithal to carry it out. And so it's all about putting that together in a sort of intelligence dashboard, if you will, and knowing who's out there and how close they are to you.
Yeah, it's almost like when we get military threats from other smaller nations, there's no way they can compete with the power that we have, and you're seeing that play out in the cyber world as they look to other forms of threat.
Exactly right. And so we know who the big players are, we also know who some of the smaller players are, and we've also seen the mingling in the cyber threat landscape of criminal activity, of activist activity, of plain old cyber theft. We've seen them all come together, sometimes supporting each other in different types of attacks and campaigns. So it's hugely complicated, and what companies are meant to do really is try to simplify this as much as they can by separating out the genuine threats from those that are just sort of static or can sit safely in the background.
And that moves on to the next topic, that you're being proactive and strategic in response to social and political activism.
That's right. So think about last year, what happened when we literally had the globe encircled with social activism and protest, all the way from places like Santiago, Chile, all the way to Hong Kong, in Paris, in London, in Beirut, really all over the world, this sort of flare-up of social activism that we haven't seen really in decades. And so it's time, it's probably past time, for companies to get very, very serious about this. Most of the activism that we saw in the previous year was aimed at governments. You saw, for example, the fares on metro tickets go up in Chile, and that's what brought people out into the streets. You saw attacks on WhatsApp calls in Lebanon, and that brought people out into the streets. Their anger is at governments. We think that this year, that anger is going to be focused on companies. Having an ESG program, having a CSR program, you've heard these acronyms before, people like to throw them around. Everyone's got to get real about it this year, and we've got to prepare, on one hand, for access problems, for physical threats, for shareholder threats, for protests all around these companies. That's the defensive bit. The proactive bit is engaging with your stakeholders in a meaningful way that's going to hold up to this activist scrutiny.
Yeah, I mean, we're hearing a lot about this at Davos this week for sure. So it's not simply ESG is a threat, but I think that stakeholders and employees and shareholders and so forth need to realize that this is a generational shift. And it's not going to happen overnight. ESG can be very arbitrary. What I might think is appropriate, you might not when it comes to governance. And it requires a lot of education and working with the community and working with your employees and recognizing this will not happen from this quarter to the quarter of 2021. It takes time. It's a cultural shift.
Absolutely. And so that shift has begun. It is gaining momentum. Think about all the people who are gathered at Davos this week. Some of them, and most of them, are the same sort of people who sit, for example, on the Business Roundtable here in the United States, right? And so the Business Roundtable is telling us now that a company's #1 focus is no longer on generating and guaranteeing shareholder return. A company's #1 focus is to be useful to society. Serve your customers, serve your employees, serve your communities, serve your business partners. And then the roundtable said, like, position #5 is worry about shareholder value. So there is a cultural shift happening. We'll see what comes out of the Swiss mountains over the coming week. But it's already started, and companies that fail to catch this wave, we think, are going to be really punished by the market.
Well, our CEO, Dina Freeman, she is on the BRT, so we are certainly seeing that cultural shift happening and having happened at Nasdaq, so that's encouraging to hear. Let's wrap up here with preparing for political instability, because there always is geopolitical risk. We are certainly going to feel it in the States with the election that's coming up in 2020, and if we thought 2016 was the hot seat, I think 2020 gets a little bit more dramatic.
Yeah, this is going to be probably one of the most intensely fought and most ideological presidential campaigns really in recent memory. And so, coming here, I'm visiting from London, from the land of Brexit, where we saw that piece of geopolitical instability really cause the business community to seize up until there was and will be some sort of resolution to the Brexit equation. And we think that the business community is going to, in part, hold its breath during the presidential campaign. But companies have got to scenario out. They've got to play out what they think is going to happen so that the result of the election doesn't take anybody by surprise. We're not going to forecast the election yet. We don't even know who the Democratic challenger is, but we know that the very presence of a presidential election campaign in the United States is going to change the way the world spins for 2020, and staying on top of that is going to be absolutely critical until we get through November.
All right, great to have you with us, Charles. And thank you for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.